Okay, this is lesson 37 and deals with oligopoly theory. And basically firms in oligopoly have high concentration ratios, and what that really means is you're looking at firms, you are looking at firms where there's only a few firms within the whole industry. Anything, they always say in the books, between 3 and 7, although it may be more than that. The firms are basically interdependent on each other. So if this firm does one thing, how do the other firms react to that? From there, there's probably going to be pretty high barriers of entry and exit. For example, just think of industries. It's going to be very, very difficult for someone to enter the car industry because you're going to have an enormous amount of finance to be able to do that. I suppose if you look at it, Tata's done it because Tata's went out and they brought Jaguar Land Rover. So that's how they entered that high-spec car market. But from scratch, it's going to be virtually impossible to enter that industry, but it's going to cost you so much money. So it's going to be very high capital costs and also extremely high sunk costs. And then on top of that, you've also got to be able to build a brand. So cars will have a high marginal minimum efficiency of scale. But I would suggest that it's still a very, very competitive market and they compete on non-price factors. The airline industry, you would also expect to be a pretty hard market to get into. However, Ryanair and EasyJet have both done it, and they've done it extremely successful based upon a low-cost model, and they've been able to take on the big guns like British Airways, and they now earn higher profits than British Airways. So it is possible to move into a new market if you think of a new business model from there. Okay. Now, basically, the main argument against a cartel. Now, what is a cartel? A cartel is when all the firms in the oligopoly industry join together and then they act as a monopoly. So then they produce a MC is equal to MR. Okay, so we just draw an ordinary monopoly diagram. However, we can say there's a deadweight welfare loss if they do that because they're not producing at the price is equal to marginal cost. So you're losing all of that area of welfare there. So the basic argument against a cartel is when firms join together is that it stops competition, but we can prove on this model that it leads to a deadweight welfare loss. There are different types of collusion. There is overt collusion, which is done by the oil countries where they actually decide on how much each country is going to produce, and everybody knows about that. Okay, that's sort of done internationally. Covert collusion is when they meet secretly, which is outside the law of competition policy, obviously. But this one's a really difficult one to deal with when there's tacit collusion. That's when firms, they all just have high prices and there's a lack of competition. But there hasn't been any secret meeting to decide upon high prices. They all just work together and say, well, we might as well charge more money because we're going to make more profits. And we sometimes wonder if that isn't done in the electricity industry within the UK. They've all roughly got the same sort of cost basis, cost model. The higher the price, they charge the more money they make because they're faced with an inelastic demand and it's much harder to deal with. Hence we have Ofgem who will look into the electricity industry, and they have a certain policy, don't they? Remember doing that, the retail price index. The retail price index minus X, and X stands for, so the firm must not increase their prices as quickly as inflation. Right, so therefore the only way they can really increase their profits is by becoming more efficient. However, they may not be open competition. Right, so if you do collude, what makes collusion more likely is if you produce similar products like the cement industry or the steel industry, and it's hard to compete because cement is cement and steel is steel. And if you have an inelastic demand for your product and if a similar cost structure. Now in that case, what you ought to do therefore is if everybody raises their price, you're all going to make more money. However, collusion is not that easy and there's always an incentive to cheat. So say on here we're working at a monopoly situation because all the firms have colluded, so there's a welfare loss, etc. But then for the individual firm over here, right, it's given a quota. You only produce this much cement or this much oil. However, it is making profits, but there's a clear incentive to break that collusion and produce more. And if it produces more, then its profits are going to go up. So even in a cartel, there is an incentive for firms to cheat from there. My next little session is on, let's have a quick look at industries and let's see whether or not they actually compete with each other. Right, now that's very hard to prove because I'm just a teacher stuck in a shed. How can I prove whether or not they're cheating or not? You just got to make some pretty strong judgments as to how good the competition is in that market. Okay, this is lesson 37, oligopoly, and it's a carry on from the previous session that we just had. Right, market structure. You can define an oligopoly through market structure, right? Because if there's 3 to 7 firms, that defines you. But maybe a better way of looking at a monopoly is to do it through their actual conduct. And the reason for that is some markets in oligopoly, you can sort of look at them and you can sort of say, well, there doesn't seem to be a lot of competition going on. But some markets are very, very innovative indeed. Actually, just as I'm talking now, off the top of my head, I mean, Apple is an incredibly innovative company and it's almost like a duopoly. There's only Apple versus Microsoft. Anyway, so oligopoly can be defined by market structure. However, some firms in some markets can behave as if they were in a very competitive market. So maybe we should really look at this in terms of the way in which the firm behaves. So if you think about the car market, I would say the car market strikes me as being a very, very competitive market. They bring out new models all the time. They do more miles to the gallon, they compete on different things. People have a good look at it to see which car they like. There is global competition. There's some new cars that come over from South Korea, like Hyundai. I think they're Korean, aren't they? Okay, so that is a very, very competitive marketplace, and it's very much a global marketplace from there. The airline industry is obviously now very, very competitive. In the old days when it was nationalised British Airways, we had one airline that we could go with. Nowadays, Ryanair and EasyJet, particularly Ryanair, have come in. They make very high profits. They've got a completely different business model. There's a lot of second-hand planes. There's less room on the plane. You can only carry a certain amount of luggage, etc. Maybe the customer service is not as good. But this is a new business model, and people are very happy to fly Ryanair because it's cheaper. And it's great, and it's lowering prices, so therefore it's more additively efficient. I would say that strikes me as being a pretty competitive marketplace. The banks, we're not so sure. We've got 4 very, very big banks, and there's real question marks about how competitive that industry is right now. But there are new ways of doing business. Things like Zoopla has come about. There's new ways, crowdfunding. There's new ways of raising money. So people tend to manoeuvre outside of the banking system, and there's big changes there as well. Now, if you said this 5, 10 years ago, and says you're completely crazy, banks are banks, and banks, you know, they're very effective in terms of what they do. I'm going to use the example of supermarkets over there. Cement. Well, cement is a place which has broken the law in the past because there's only a few firms. Cement is cement after all. It's maybe difficult to innovate in that particular market, but they're faced with an inelastic demand, so therefore they've been charging high prices, and hopefully they think that they can get away with it, although they were caught. I would say the supermarket industry right now is a pretty competitive market. Nobody ever believed that Tesco's would have a hard time when they're under Sir Terry Leahy. But what's happened recently is when the recession hit, people became much more aware on price. And so really Aldi and Lidl have come along, and they've got they have a different business model compared to Tesco's. And in particular, that model is, right, just have a few brands. Don't have loads and loads and loads of brands, because it's much cheaper to have far fewer things. And if you do that, then the supermarket is going to do much better. So this is to do with a slightly different business model, and that shows that the market is competitive. Now Tesco's is having to react to that. Waitrose is also having to react to it, sort of high quality image, but it was also Morrison's as well. Morrison's got some new stores out, haven't they, that have tried to copy Aldi and Lidl, where they have much fewer brands. In the old days when I was job at Aldi, which was incredibly cheap, it was about 3p for a tin of baked beans, but they literally just stacked them high. And they didn't barcode anything. The person on the till could remember all the different prices. And you put your food on the conveyor belt, and then it just flew off at the far end unless you got your trolley round. It was a very sort of efficient, very, very basic system. But the prices were low and it was cheap. I mean, we used to shop, for 3 of us, we used to shop for about £30 a week. I know it was 20 odd years ago. I'm an old duffer now, but okay. But I would say that is a competitive market. So when you look at oligopoly, think about the industry that you're in, and does it show signs, is its conduct of a competitive marketplace? Because it may not be competitive, e.g. cement. The other thing as well is, along the syllabus that wasn't there before, is that there is cooperation. Firms may not collude, but they may cooperate with each other. I think Renault and Nissan cooperated with each other on certain models, so they come up with certain ideas, certain ways of doing things, and maybe there's a synergy there with the companies that they may come up with new ideas and produce an even better car. So that is overt. People know that's going on, and the firms are probably still competing with each other, but they just think that they may be signs where they can work together, so there's good synergy there as well without having a merger. Okay,